Hi, and welcome to this video on background page processing with Apex. So background page processing allows you to run page processes in the background or asynchronously. It also allows you to track the progress of these processes using an Apex view and an API. And you can configure things like the number of processes that can run in the same time, whether processes run one after the other, and whether some processes are not compatible with other processes, that kind of thing. So some of the advantages of background page processing: it can definitely be a better user experience because if a process takes a long time, the user can get on with other work. It's also a much better use of your ORDS connection pool. So having that connection open for a minute or however long that process takes can severely impact your overall health of your ORDS connection pool, because that connection can't be used by any other Apex or REST services connections. It also avoids those gateway timeout errors. So a lot of web servers are set up to time out after 5 minutes. So running that in the database avoids that. And finally, it allows you to move that processing to a consumer group that consumes less CPU. So you can kind of wall off those background processes so they can't have a larger impact on your database. Some use cases for background page processing. One is if you're uploading a file and then processing the data in that file, hundreds of thousands of records. Maybe your users are selecting a bunch of records to process, so any batch processing would be better off happening in the background. Essentially anything that takes more than 10 seconds or so to run, I think should be run in the background. So now that we've covered what it is, let's look at an example. So we have a page process here called example background page process, and it's of a type execution chain. So this process is our execution chain. So it itself has an execution chain of none because this is the parent, and we've set it to run in the background, and that's the key here, is to run this process in the background. Then we can determine the page item that the ID of the page process should be returned to. So when Apex submits this execution chain, it'll generate a unique ID, which we can save in this page item, and then use that to get statuses on the background process. The context information, so this is a page item that contains some contextual information, and this can be viewed in the view, the Apex view and the PL/SQL API. But it's also used in conjunction with this serialized flag. So essentially, when you set serialization on, let's take a look at this next. When you set serialization on, Apex is going to run any processes that have the same context information serially, one after the other. And if you don't have a context value, so if that's empty, then whenever it runs this process, it will always run it serially, one after the other. So that context information is key when using serialization. If you're not using serialization, then it can just be useful to inject some extra context information into the database view, so when you're monitoring that, you can see that context information. Temporary file handling is related to that scenario I talked about where you're doing a file upload. So essentially the user still has to do the file upload in real time, but then that file gets put into those Apex temporary file tables, and we want to move, here we have an opportunity to move those files to the background session, so that background page process session has access to those files. So move will move them from the session that you're running the page in to the background process session. Copy will take a copy of those files to the background page process. So that way, when your background page process is running, you can run Apex Data Parser or whatever against those files. Execution limit is basically the number of times you can allow the user of this, in this particular instance, to run this background page process. So if you set this to 3, user goes in and hits submit 3 times. On the 4th attempt, it's going to say, no, you've run this too many times. Now, once those other 3 processes have completed running, then the counter sort of gets reset. But basically, you're stopping the user from abusing this process. And 99 times out of 100, this execution limit is probably going to be set to 1. Submit immediately. What this does is it acts a bit like an autonomous transaction. So if you had some other processes here and you run this background page process and then some other processes, if those other processes failed and rolled back, if you do submit immediately, it will submit that background process no matter what. But if you have submit immediately turned off, then the background page process will get rolled back essentially and not happen if those other processes fail. And then we have this serialization flag, which we talked about already. But there's one other option that comes with that, and that is to determine what happens when your user has submitted more than one instance of this background page process. So wait, essentially it will wait until the previous executions are finished. So if we had this execution limit set to 3, it would wait for those 3 to finish before it would allow them to submit another one. Error, it would basically stop the user from submitting any more processes. All right, so now we need to define what this background process is going to do. So we create a child process that is then pointed to that execution chain, which is our parent process. In this case, I'm running some PL/SQL code. I'm calling this Apex background process.setStatus. So this is going to set the status of a value in the Apex view. So we could potentially present this to the end user to know that this part of the process is complete. So I'm not actually running any code here. I'm just sleeping for 10 seconds. And then I have another step 2, which is doing the same thing. I'm just letting the background page process know that we've now reached step 2, and then sleeping for another 10 seconds. So nothing interesting happening there. So a couple of other settings we should look at. So let's look at the application definition and the maximum background processes, page process jobs. So this is basically determines the maximum number of page processes that this application will be allowed to run in parallel. So if you have page processes in multiple pages within this application, it's only going to allow you to run one at a time. So users could submit 10 and they'll get queued up to run, but only one will run simultaneously. So that's a good way to limit the amount of processes. If you set this to 0, then this will stop any job processes from running. It will still queue up jobs, but nothing will run until you unset that. And we'll see where we can use this during application deployments shortly. So another area where you can make changes is if I change to the internal workspace here. And let's go to Manage Instance and Instance Settings. And we'll scroll all the way across here to Background Jobs. So there is a background page process job class here. And this is using essentially the database resource manager so you can define a class that's associated with a resource plan, which can basically have the effect that these jobs will run in a different resource group. And maybe you've configured that resource group so that it can only use 5% of the CPU. So this is where you can impact the overall impact on your database your background jobs can have. And this is set at the instance level. All right, so let's look now at the impact when you are deploying your applications that have background page processes. So I'm going to export this app that we were just looking at, and I'm going to import it into another instance. So I have another instance in apex.oracle.com. So I'm going to install the application in this instance. And in this instance, I already have the application ID 99314. So Apex has realized that I have background page processes defined in the application, and that the application already exists. So what they're afraid of essentially is if you already have a background page process running and then you install the application, that's going to cause a disconnect with that in-flight background page process. So what you can do is click this button, Disable Background Execution, and this will set that application level setting, the number of background processes, to 0. So essentially stop any new processes from running, but it'll still allow them to get queued up. So now that that's happened, if I then replace the application, so that's just installing the application just like we would in any other application deployment. So now if I look at that application definition, look at the setting, we can see this has been set back to 1. So after I click that initial button, that was set to 0, but then it puts it back to the value that was in the import file once it's finished. So now that we've seen the background, let's look at one running. So I have this is the two processes that we just saw in Apex Builder. So I've got step 1 and step 2 with just a sleep happening in between it. So this is the context information that I'm going to set for that context page item that we looked at. I'm going to start the process. So you see I've got this process 92076 returned to me, and I've got this context region here just showing me what's going on. So if I hit refresh, you can see it started step 1. Now it's on to step 2, and it's executing. So this is querying from the Apex view. We'll take a look at that in a moment. And now the process is complete. So let's take a quick look at how we did that. So I have this progress content row region, and then I'm selecting from this Apex Apple page BG proc status. So I select from that for the execution ID that the background page process returned to our page item when it was submitted, and a few other pieces of information. I can then put together this region to show the status of my background page process. So I'm using template directives here based on whether the current process is running to show when it was last updated versus when it was completed. So this is just some template component functionality to improve the look of that region. Alright, so that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it.